Hi, and welcome to Conversations with B'rith. I'm CEO Dan Mariaschin. Today, we're delving into a topic that is as urgent as it is misunderstood: urban warfare and how it has played out in the Israel-Hamas war in Gaza. My guest is John Spencer, one of the world's foremost experts on urban warfare and chair of the Urban Warfare Studies at the Modern War Institute at West Point. But before we get into today's conversation, a quick reminder: if you enjoyed this program, subscribe to Conversations with B'rith wherever you get your podcasts and leave us a rating. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow us on Facebook to stay updated with all of our latest content. Since the October 7th terrorist massacre by Hamas, Israel has been the subject of intense and unfair scrutiny. International discourse has largely ignored military realities on the ground and the unprecedented efforts the IDF has taken to minimize civilian harm while confronting a brutal enemy embedded in civilian infrastructure. One of the clearest voices cutting through the noise is my guest today, John Spencer. He's chair of the Urban Warfare Studies at the Modern War Institute at West Point and a former U.S. Army major with over 25 years of experience in combat and military strategy. He's been one of the few experts to speak publicly and credibly about what's been happening in Gaza. Spencer has been vocal and unwavering. Israel has set a new standard in urban warfare, even as critics ignore the facts and push misinformation. Today, we'll discuss what makes this conflict so complex, how the IDF's tactics compare to those of other democracies, and what the world is getting wrong. John Spencer is widely regarded as a leading authority on urban warfare. He's a former infantry officer with over 25 years of service in the U.S. Army. He has advised military forces around the world and, again, currently serves as chair of Urban Warfare Studies at the Modern War Institute at West Point. He's also co-founder and executive director of the Urban Warfare Institute, a nonprofit dedicated to advancing the study of urban environments, operations, and warfare. And he's also the host of the Urban Warfare Project podcast. Spencer is the author of 3 books, including Connected Soldiers, Life, Leadership, and Social Connections in Modern War. And his analyses have appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Foreign Policy, Newsweek, and more. He's conducted on-the-ground research in conflict zones such as Ukraine and the Middle East, and is a leading voice on the ethics, strategy, and realities of modern combat in cities. John, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thanks for having me, Dan, and thanks for reading all that. I really appreciate it.
Well, let's start with your own story before we get into the details of the issues at hand. How did you get into the field of urban warfare, and what drew you to study it so closely?
Sure. That's a great question. I mean, of course, I had my own experiences in urban warfare and 2 deployments to Iraq, but it was the academic study that really intrigued me as I was working for a 4-star general in the Pentagon. And for a year, we studied, could the U.S. military, prepared for any environment, operate in a very large city like a mega city of over 10 million, which led to a realization that there was actually this giant gap in the study, really the long-term study, continuous study of military operations in urban areas, cities, and other large urban areas. And then when I moved to West Point, was teaching strategy, tactics, and other things, created the research center and started writing. And that was over a decade ago, started writing and researching urban operations. And the more I researched, the more I found there's a gap in the knowledge, in the preparation, even though the world was urbanizing at at a astronomical rate, right? More people live in cities than not in cities, in rural areas. And all these changes, and we've seen them on the battlefield, is that where militaries used to avoid urban areas, now they're unavoidable. And there are other factors of the power that a non-state actor gets by pulling a military, turning the laws of war against a military, their own ethics, and trying to complicate what is already the most complex type of warfare there is. But really, I mean, I do it because I really appreciate the scholarship of advancing the body of knowledge, and it's come to be very necessary, as we've seen.
Yeah, I mean, what you say about fighting in cities or in built-up areas is really of the moment, given the demographic changes. You're right, all over the world. In your 2022 mini manual for the urban defender guide, you emphasize that it's meant for those fighting just wars, not for those committing atrocities. Why was it important to draw that ethical line, and how does it shape your approach to urban warfare?
Yeah, that was really important to me as I developed that within days of the illegal Russian invasion of Ukraine, as a guide for how to defend their sovereign terrain. But it was really important as that manual grew legs I didn't know it would. It started to be, of course, it was translated in Ukrainian for the Ukrainian civilians who were then turning themselves into combatants and resisting the Russian invasion. But it was also translated into 16 other languages. And there was a real fear that the not unknown, very well known, but never collected in a simple way, tactics of urban warfare would fall into the hands of those who do, there is, I believe, base evil intention. So I had to make that upfront. This is not for that. This is for protecting, defending, and these elements. And you get into just war theory, but that was really important for me to put it as it grew legs and started to be translated into so many different other languages that, not only are my intentions good, but whoever reads this, their intentions should be good. And that's really hard. Even recently, having a lot of debates on the morality of war and when should somebody go to war, are they involved in the war? And even that manual, you have to point out, like, look, you can do these things, but you can't do these things. Like, you can't use hospitals as shields against attack. And those kind of things are really important for people to know in general.
In a piece in Newsweek in March of 2024, you wrote that Israel has created a new standard in urban warfare. And just to set the table, just to go back to all that we know, you have an enemy here that doesn't wear a uniform, that hides in hospitals, apartment buildings, schools, mosques, that places no value on the lives of its fellow citizens. Tell us more about this new standard that Israel has brought to the battlefield over these past 18 months and before that.
Sure. And I actually been misquoted many times on that, where I said that was the title of the article, but I don't necessarily view it as a holistically good thing. And I was misquoted to say it was a gold standard. What it was is that Israel, in the evolution of urban warfare and the evolution of warfare in general, many militaries, and this is why I take a case study methodology, where I write case studies about what's happened in the past, or a comparative analysis, comparing what's happening in Gaza to anything that's come before, which I wrote those pieces as well. It's like, stop trying to compare this to an apple to an orange and counterinsurgency battle or something like that. But from this new standard, when a defender of urban terrain defends and prepares the ground for defense, but then doesn't follow any of the legal obligations of a defending force, like separating combatants and non-combatants, military infrastructure from civilian infrastructure, all these things. That was an evolution, right? So we saw this in Al-Qaeda, ISIS, basically every terrorist organization who doesn't care what the laws of war, the law of armed conflict, humanitarian interest in the law. They don't care about it, so they use this thing called human shields. But of course, Hamas, again, different in the comparative analysis, did human sacrifice. But even with that, because Israel, like other Western militaries, in similar cases, but not at this same context, is a moral, ethical, following the legal aspects of the war, does certain things, and they call them civilian harm mitigations, to reduce the harm to civilians, like evacuating civilians out of urban areas before attack, which is not a requirement, but it's the correct thing to do depending on the context, balancing both the military necessity and the humanitarian concern. But Israel created new standards in that. I'm like, how do you notify civilians? Where in the past, most militaries, Western militaries, would drop flyers or use TV announcements, radio announcements. Israel took their basically startup nation technologies to advance that to a level that's never been created, like calling everybody, every single individual, or sending them text messages or voicemails, or using facial recognition, or using drones with speakers, or doing daily pauses to allow civilians during the battle to evacuate because the combatant on the other side, Hamas, is trying to get civilians killed. These are the new standards that I wrote, and there are about 10 of them. One, standards that have never been tried in the history of war, that Israel was trying to prevent civilian harm, or things like tracking civilians by their cell phones and then color coding maps, or handing out military maps to the civilians and giving up the element of surprise against the enemy in the pursuit of humanitarian concern. This is the new standards that I wanted to point out that Israel was creating, and should be acknowledged for the extent above and beyond the legal requirements to protect civilians that Israel was doing. Now, I point out in the article that it would not necessarily be the standard going forward. And we could talk about how there's been lots of standards attempted to be pointed at Israel that weren't standards. They were double standards, if not a triple standard. These aren't standards like calculating the civilian casualty in real time. That's not a standard of war. It's actually impossible to do. But this new standard that Israel had created should be applauded, as in how many efforts they're taking, despite the context that nobody's faced in modern times, to protect civilians in war.
John, I think there's one other element, and Israel's army is largely a reserve army, and so many, most able-bodied men and women who were needed were called up. There is also something about the Israeli soldier. I mean, the intent was to defend their country from this terrible attack which occurred and to defeat the enemy. It wasn't to go out for riches. It wasn't to go out to create havoc. It wasn't to go out to claim as many lives as it could. And I think, that is a factor which oftentimes is from people who don't know the idea of simply dismissed. Now, you visited Israel after October 7th and wrote powerfully about what you saw. From your perspective, as one of the world's primary experts on urban warfare, what did you observe about Hamas's intent on that day, on October 7th, from all that you saw?
Absolutely. And I've now been to Israel 5 times since October 7th, 4 times into Gaza, observing IDF in operations in pursuit of my research. But you're right, especially when I visited in December of 2023, analyzing and going to the sites of the October 7th attack, which is really hard. Even me, as somebody who studies war for a living, it was hard for me to grasp and comprehend the full scale and intent, methodology, the sheer amount of rehearsals and planning that went into Hamas's actions on October 7th. From what they were trying to do, and I wrote, like in Time magazine, just about one site like Far Aza, how methodical and military level planning and execution was done on a civilian place, a village, a town, how much military training and execution of that plan to massacre the civilians went into, from my eyes, as walking the ground. But by every intention, this is where I don't like people calling it a terrorist attack, although, of course, terrorism was used in the methodology and the recording of it, but it was an invasion of essentially a division level military to destroy everything in its path, but also to further destroy the nation of Israel. I mean, the intentions of Hamas wasn't to hit, and it did hit, and because of Israelis, many Israeli civilians standing literally in the door to stop Hamas's forward progress as it was trying to go north. It was trying to get to other sites in both civilian in Jerusalem and other places. It expected their friends in Hezbollah to join them. They just did a miscommunication. Both the actions and intentions of Hamas on October 7th was to fulfill their charter to destroy Israel and to kill all the Jewish people on it.
We've talked so many times during the course of not only this Gaza war, but the ones that preceded it, about the use of civilians in Gaza as human shields. And you would think that this would be something readily understood, that you're putting weapons in the basement of an apartment building. You've got rockets in an UNRWA school. You've got a launcher next to a mosque. What do you think the world gets so blatantly wrong about this particular tactic?
I'm not sure. I teach it, of course, in the courses that I teach. And I think some people identify it as wrong, but then they can't match that versus believing that there's another way to overcome that human shield strategy. And with Hamas, I always point out, like, I've fought people using human shields, but what Hamas does by their own statements and actions is this human sacrifice strategy, right? So like the tunnel network, which is very unique to Hamas. Right? The tunnels aren't new in warfare, but digging 400 miles of tunnels, $1 billion worth of concrete and steel solely underneath your own civilians for the purpose of not using them as just shields from attack, but using them as the political strategy, as there's no other way to get to Hamas than to cause the destruction that people see. Even if you move all the civilians out, that's a sacrificing strategy. If that's the goal for your political objective to achieve your goal, that's unique. And I think those type of distinctions people are for some reason not getting, because they jump to, they don't have a framework in which to understand that mentality, or that they want this shared human value that, of course, they wouldn't want their people harmed, even though they're saying it, even though the way they radicalize the population, that is the goal, is to sacrifice in order to achieve this higher level ideological, political goal in the war. But I can't speak for everybody, but some of it becomes like it's just so foreign to our values or a Western value set to say, when they say, I need the death of my women and children, they mean that. That's not hyperbole. And then they do it in everything they've designed and every action they take during the war from October 7th on.
Yeah, I think about getting it wrong, and perhaps it's something else. Perhaps it's simply, don't confuse me with the facts. You're telling me that civilians are used as human shields. That's very uncomfortable. They say but I'm looking at something else. And that brings me to one of the statistics that you've cited, which is striking. The ratio of combatant to civilian deaths in Gaza, the lowest in modern warfare. How is that measured, and what does it tell us? Because, we've seen since October 7th, these highly inflated figures that are not factoring in terrorist deaths in recent days. Even now, there are people who are admitting, we're also factoring in natural deaths, of which by natural causes, of which there are about 7,500 per year in Gaza. So how do you measure all of this, and what does it tell us?
So the way I started measuring it was comparative analysis. So for some reason, this question of what is your civilian to combatant death ratio is never a question I've ever heard before this war. This is an Israeli question. And as an urban warfare student, I know that one of the reasons that that's not a question is because, one, that's not how the framework of war works. It's not effects based. It's not post operations that justify during it, like whether you're being legal, moral, or ethical. It's just that number isn't the evidence of intent and actions. It's effects based. But in order to do the comparison, just to kind of answer the rhetoric that was wrong, one, there's, in my world, there's three types of lies, lies, damn lies, and statistics. I can make the numbers mean and say, as long as I make the number as big as I possibly can, and that's what we've seen Hamas do, then I can justify my opinion and position. But I started by one showing, okay, if you take any comparable battle, let alone a war, because this is a war, you can't compare the war in Gaza. This is another tactic of the numbers, is to aggregate all the numbers and then compare it to something that you're disaggregating the numbers. I did that by showing the ratio, if we're going to talk about ratios, was lower than in anything close to similar battle with a contested defending enemy using human shields, but not human sacrifice. Israel's numbers were still lower, even if we took the terrorist numbers. A lot of work has been done to question one, the terrorist number. I try to do the work on, there isn't a number. There's never been a number during a battle or a war. It's usually months, years, and in cases of war too, decades before you know a number that anybody would view as reliable. But for some reason in this war, because it's Israel and because it's Hamas, the number gets generated by Hamas within minutes and hours and then fully accepted. And then people start doing but what's your ratio thing without, like you said, well, who's the one saying that the body of the person you're talking about, if you have a body, in most cases they didn't, that person was a civilian versus a combatant partaking in the hostilities. So there's so many elements that I've tried to highlight. And yes, I started by showing the comparative analysis, but now I want to get us out of the numbers game because that's not how war works. Yes, there's been lots of work to show that the numbers were double numbers, natural deaths. People get younger on the list. People change demographics on the list. Because then if the number wasn't high enough, they didn't start to take demographics like the most number of children or the most women. Despite the realities of, okay, what are you evaluating as a child? Can a child be a combatant? All these awful things that people are trying to delegitimize Israel's actions, despite what they're doing, to create a double standard and, to demonize the idea of soldiers like you were talking about, which I have never gotten from interviews with scores of IDF soldiers, that they're out for revenge. They're intentionally targeting anything other than a Hamas combatant, all these elements.
Yeah, well, of course, at the base of all of this over these past months has been the source. So in the beginning, it was the Gaza Health Ministry. Then when these folks were called out, some of the media were called out for using those figures. Then it became the Hamas Health Ministry. It has since come back to the Gaza Health Ministry. Hamas seems to have gotten lost in the shuffle here. And so, again, as we say, consider the source. And in this particular case, you have to consider the source. Now, standing side by side with these charges is the international community, which continues to accuse Israel, many in the international community, to accuse Israel of genocide, committing genocide. And there is a definition, and that definition was largely put together, the UN definition, by Raphael Lemkin, who himself was Jewish, came from a Polish family that was totally destroyed during the Holocaust. And the word intent is very much a part of this. It's the intent. Now, we just talked about the IDF and the intent. The intent here is to defeat the enemy. As a military expert, how do you respond to and rebut those charges, especially when considering the issue of intent?
Yeah. So the way I rebut that is through research, right? So there are many forms of research, but if you want to prove intent, you have to identify the source of the intent, right? So from commander to a plan, all these things that get evaluated, and what is the intent of the military? Their statements, their plans, and then it's validated by their actions, right? You can't tell me Israel is intentionally committing a genocide if I show you the evidence, not the statement that is counter to that, whether that's how they conduct their operations or what they're sending into the environment, food, medical, every element. I think it is just baseless and ludicrous to take a single statement of somebody to say that shows an intent. Now, intent is proven in many forms, in many ways. And it's so, it's almost anti-intellectual for me to defend based on all the available evidence that even somebody who doesn't visit is available to show what the IDF intent is in Gaza, from every plan to statement of the objectives to the actions on the ground that are counter the somewhat argument of intention.
One of my responses has been, there was the hospital several months ago the hospital in North Gaza, where the IDF went in, captured 240 terrorists in one wing of the hospital, killed 20 terrorists. And in the other wing of the hospital, patients were still being treated. Those who were intubated, those who were receiving IV, all the things that patients who are in hospitals for, they were receiving at the same time. I mean, when you consider, and you're the expert, But when you consider urban warfare, hospitals are being used as weapons depots and command and control centers and so forth. And to maintain the medical care at the same time that you're carrying out the military objective, to me, basically says it all, explains it.
So, Dan, it's not just me, and I've done a lot of research, and I come with a body of awareness of what's come before, but every military expert from 4-star, 3-star, 2-star academic that has actually gone to Israel on whether it's an organized group or independently and observed IDF operations from many countries, UK, Italy, Germany, Spain, you name it, every one of them says, no, Israel is not only following the legal requirements, but is going above and beyond. It is, this is going back to the facts. You can have your own opinions. You can't have your own facts.
You've been a clear and consistent voice in correcting the narrative around Israel's necessary actions at a time when few others have done the same. What drives you to speak out so publicly on this? Because really I would say, John, from day one, I know in our community, your name appears many times in articles, in op-eds, in interviews, in speeches, because your voice was one of clarity and moral clarity. What drives you to speak out?
I've gotten that a lot, actually, Dan. And I want to say that I think the truth matters. I don't want to live in a world where my kids grow up and the truth doesn't matter. I don't like bullies. I don't like the fact that I have been somewhere and somebody tell me that what I see isn't true. I think with great knowledge comes great responsibility. And for some reason, when the lies started, which started on October 8th, I was one of the people with a body of knowledge that was helpful to fight back against the lies from, Gaza's the densest place on earth to the IDF is doing X, Y, and Z. There are so many motivations, but I think the actual question is all those who are remaining silent. Why are you silent when you know this is not right? Every double standard created and waged towards Israel, every statement about intention that isn't a truth, it's just not right. And I would wish the focus would be on all those that are remaining silent that to know this isn't right, because I also believe, as somebody who's been to Israel many times and walked the ground of, the holy sites that are holy to everybody and all that Israel is in its inclusivity and its cultural diversity and all this stuff, and for there to be something opposite of that into some type of narrative, but down to the specifics of the military operations, the truth still matters.
Yeah, well, there are ideological and political issues at play here, and it I think moves to the category of don't confuse me with the facts. We meet many diplomats along the way. I've had this discussion many, many times. These folks know it. Their militaries know it. Their intelligence services know exactly what's going on the ground. You've said that many have various countries, particularly in the military, know this for sure. But there's a tendency here for people simply to say, I hear what you're saying, but I'm not going to do it. And what this does is this takes Israel's justified actions in Gaza and it stills other prominent voices, to not join you. It stills their voices and it prevents them, perhaps for various reasons, not and any of them are excusable, from saying the kinds of things that you've said.
Yeah, I've seen that as well. And this is, again, going back to my values, right? I was basically 25 years in the military, values, character, doing the right thing despite the consequences is a big part of the values that our military espouses and creates. So I 100% agree with you. And to me, it's the same thing for the politics. I say I don't do politics, but I do war, which war is politics by other means. So I don't care if it's an election year. Be a person of character, stand up for the truth and what's right. And for me, shame on you. Not you, but them.
Finally, John, what would you say to those who want to get the facts straight on the conflict? How do we move the conversation back toward truth and nuance and context?
It's hard because war is so complex and there are so many areas of study you have to know. And there have been voices that have risen to the top, whether it's actual what's happening in urban warfare to what are the real rules of law of war. And then you start to get into like the United Nations and you have this mixture of political theater where they're making up laws and standards that aren't true and then trying to adjudicate those. What I say is listen to those voices, not just me, that rise to the top of the noise of bias, history, all of this of those groups. And hopefully we see some changes. And we have seen, even in the United States, with a new UN ambassador to the United States, or of the United States to the United Nations, and others that will try to put this awfulness that has been exposed back into reality, and then also deconstruct the paid programs of disinformation that are a part of this. What I usually tell people in this realm is that it becomes overwhelming, and people could say the hate that I have received would be overwhelming to other people. But this is what they want. This is what the disinformation, all of the other side wants, is you to feel like you don't have a voice and can't fight. And we all have to fight for the right, for our way of life, for who we are, for the truth.
Exactly. Well, to explore more of John Spencer's work and analysis, visit johnspenceronline.com. John, thank you for sharing your expertise with such clarity and with such conviction. We're truly grateful for your voice and the important work that you continue to do in speaking truth when it's needed most. It's been a real honor having you on the program.
Thanks for having me, Dan.
Well, that's it for today's episode of Conversations with B'rith. A huge thank you to John Spencer and to our listeners. Thank you for tuning in. Remember, the conversation doesn't end here. Share this episode with others, post about it on social media, or leave us a comment or a rating. To stay updated, follow or subscribe to Conversations with B'rith wherever you get your podcasts. And be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel and like us on Facebook for more great content. We'll be back soon with more important discussions on Jewish history, culture, and issues that matter most to our community and beyond. Until then, this is your host, Dan Mariaschin. Take care, everyone.